It's a pleasure to be here for this Congress. I've long focused on these areas as my professional career started 52 years ago developing medicines when I first joined Eli Lilly and Company. And over those 5 decades, I've observed just this remarkable transformation of the concept of a drug into changing people's lives. It started in my life as a concept of a product. The product is merely a vehicle to something more important. And it's the centricity of the patient that I'd like to focus on this morning, as I think it's imperative that we think about this in a larger context than we traditionally do. And that doesn't mean that we weaken our expectation of the development of product or techniques or whatever, but it's really only a useful concept when these components actually are applied and produce a desired result. And we've seen that on a number of cases, and I will set forth a couple of things this morning that I think would be useful models for us to think about. History has shown that the actual development of technology is simply not enough. In 1960, when I first enrolled at the University of Tennessee in College of Engineering, there was this clarion call from the President of the United States, John Kennedy, that we would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And I recall sitting in the engineering classes the day after and the professor standing up and saying, "This is our job as engineers, and we haven't the foggiest idea how to do it. So you better get to work on studying even harder for us to imagine that we could do that." And it was that sort of outcome that produced a remarkable series of inventions and discoveries and applications during the decade of the 60s that we are benefiting from today, including much of what we hold in our hand as a cell phone emanated from material science that was required in order to efficiently put the minimum amount of mass on an orbiting spaceship to get to the moon and then recover the humans in that and bring them back safely. It was all about an energy-mass relationship. Not possible at that time. The same thing can be said for the genetics revolution that we discovered in the 80s when we figured out that there was this fantastic series of code embedded in each of us. And the imagination was, if we could simply unlock the code, all of the problems would be resolved. And we know, of course, today that's going to take a little longer than the decade took us to put a man on the moon, but it also reflects the fact that these discoveries in and of themselves are insufficient for actually moving things forward. We live in an age today where healthy life's extension is quite possible. We've imagined, as Dr. Fleming said, these agents that are already with us, including pharmaceutical agents as well as mobile applications and all the other treatments or ideas that we have. We can imagine life expansion. But I would say to you, it's important that we imagine life expansion at the same time we imagine a quality of life along with that expansion. The simple addressing of age without the addressing of the concomitant characteristics that we so often associate with age is undershooting. It's a minor expectation, in my opinion. And I think we need to think about this from as many dimensions as possible. And the more I've studied this space and the more I've been involved in it, there is simply no way that one can rationally expect a single solution to resolve this. And the only force, and that's the secret, not the secret, the center of my talk today is much like Richard said earlier, it really relies on the individual. We have to think about this as centered on the person themselves, engaging the power that's there. And today, even there's a parallel in oncology. We now have hope for curing cancer in large measure just by simply empowering the system that already resides in each of us. Our immune system is such a powerful system. The engagement of that immune system in a targeted way gives us realistic expectations. I would say that it's more than technology, though. We need to think about this in the context of the societies in which we live, the environments in which we work and play. and as Julia said earlier, and sit and watch TV and eat chips and drink beer and do not exercise. In a minute, I'll show you some statistics on obesity that are frightening in the United States. I suspect they're similar across the world, but we don't have as good a data as we do within Haines. But embedded in this also is an important aspect of government policy. We have unfortunately siloed most of our approaches to human life into the minister of this or the department of that or the secretary of this, each of which leads us to think that the resolution resides almost solely in that particular functional area. That's not how we live. It's how we sometimes break problems down. Even in engineering, we had the various departments, and we, just to give you a sidebar, I serve on the board of the University of Tennessee College of Engineering, and one of the problems we faced was the inadequacies of our education to treat engineers or to teach engineers so they could become practicing engineers when they graduated. And the thing that was missing is that we had failed to teach them that engineering is a team science, not an individual science. Who here would drive across a bridge designed by a sole engineer? Or take a medicine authenticated by one particular discipline? It's not feasible. So we started a complete review of the engineering curriculum and started team teaching in the freshman year. Nobody got an individual grade. You got a grade on the basis of your team of 4. 3 things happened. We increased the retention rate of minorities and women who had, unfortunately, in the K through 12 system, did not have as much energy to move into STEM. But more importantly, our graduation rate and employment rate, we got profound feedback. So it was that integration that was one of these aha moments for me. And as I started thinking about that in the health system, we're no different. We have our departments of this and our groups of this. Even in medicine itself, the specialties across medicine have become necessarily so much more disciplined on the things that are necessary for them to understand that complex space, that the generalist is regarded as, unfortunately, among the lower members of the practicing fraternity. The family practicing physician is oftentimes seen as, well, the gatekeeper, but not really the owner of the real science. But I would argue that eventually we will find that it's the engagement of the individual, and that's best done by somebody who's treating the whole person. What we're doing today is not sufficient. We've studied this. I spent 28 years with Eli Lilly and Company and the next 10 in biotech, and I can tell you that one of the things that we found so frustrating was to spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing a medicine and find that people took 55 to 60% of the medicines they should take. And why was that? And many forces come into play, but I think a large portion is, as we've studied this, and some will disagree with me, but the patient themselves plays such an important role in compliance in terms of how do they view themselves and how do they view what they are responsible for in this process. I think one of the things that's missing is the sense that the patient actually assumes responsibility for, and I use the phrase ownership, although Julia will tell me that there's some pushback to that word, but let me define it in this context and I'll try to develop it more. It's the degree to which an individual feels that they themselves have made a decision for which they are responsible and for which they look forward to seeing the results from that. It's not unlike when you choose to purchase an item after have studied the situation and you buy it, when you receive it and you turn it on if it's a device and it works and you feel satisfied. There is a completion of a circle of that affirmation that you made a wise choice, it was delivered on time, in the States by Amazon, maybe here as well, and it worked, first time. That is a completion of an affirmation idea. Unfortunately, in medicine, many of the things we ask people to do not give an immediate feedback, and certainly not the increasing of quality life of aging. How would anybody even perceive a feedback from that? I think that disruption is going to occur in the pharmaceutical market and indeed healthcare, not unlike what we've seen in transportation, communication, and education, and I believe it will occur at the level of the patient and physician relationship. An example, maybe not perfect, but certainly useful for us to talk about, is the diagnosis of cancer. Immediately there's an activation energy both in the patient and the family. Things get organized, there's support groups, people begin engaging. There's a conversation about what do I need to do? How can I beat this? We will fight this, we will win. A diagnosis of obesity, I use the phrase, is usually greeted by a yawn or so what? And there's no support group that says, okay, let's go together, let's work on this, or seldom is there one. In fact, it's sometimes seen even as a mark of either affluence or having arrived, that I have sufficient means to live a style of life like I want. Here's some data that back up what Richard said. In the United States, the recent NHANES survey on obesity, this is available online. I've got the reference, but it's too small for you to read. 39.6% of the U.S. population is classified as obese. Look at the second line. This is youth, 18.5%. That is a train wreck. As my friend Fran Kaufman, who practices diabetes endocrinology in the city of Los Angeles, said, you cannot imagine what it's like treating the number of subjects who come into my room where I cannot lift them on the examination table, and they're youth, they're adolescents. She's a pediatric endocrinologist. She described a 150-kilo young lady of 12 years of age. Imagine that. Imagine the quality of life that that person's expecting. Unfortunately, in many of our communities, kids live in a latchkey society. They come home from school. There's no safe parks to play in because of the crime around in the neighborhood. Both parents are working. They lock the door, they watch TVs, and eat Cheetos. And as a result, we're seeing this unbelievable amount of impact on our future society. This second graph shows how these impacts are not equally assigned. Let me see if I can make this work. So this is non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, non-Hispanic Asian, Hispanics. Look at these numbers. 47% total men and women, non-Hispanic black women, which, by the way, if you were to plot hypertension, you would find a tremendous amount of concordance in this group. There is a double-edged sword going on with obesity and hypertension, especially in non-Hispanic black. But here's the one that bothered me. Children. 25, 28, 23. Hispanic. These individuals, unless we change the way in which we're approaching this subject on a very large scale, are going to live lives of impaired function, pain, disability, and staggering cost to our society. And I don't mean to say that we should simply be worried about this because of the cost, but cost is an element, because cost independently will influence those departments I talked about earlier to allocate resources and to bring about changes. Why are we worried about this? I want to introduce 3 or 4 slides that I borrowed from a recent talk given by the global managing director of McKinsey. And there are some in here who are graduates of McKinsey, and I have high respect for that group. They are among the best in strategically thinking. But look at this number. 60% of the world's population are going to live in urban areas by 2030. What do we know about urban areas? We know that exercise as a component of lifestyle is less. We know that intensification of energy consumption and stress are higher. And we know that sleep time and patterns are less productive in urban environments than they are in rural environments. That's going to compound the impact of other societal forces. Moreover, we look at the economic growth because that's where wealth is created, that's where services will be provided, and 600 cities will drive 60% of the global GDP by 2025. So while citizens are going to be vertically stacked in these places, so is the economics. And we're fast approaching a time where we are going to have to ask ourselves, how are we going to take care of those folks? This picture is, I think, very striking. This is a picture of Shanghai in 1987. 2013. Let me back up. And that's not the end of it. There are 50 or so cranes sitting in Shanghai today. In fact, most major cities today, you just have to look out the windows here at the hotel. There are cranes everywhere. I wish I'd thought about the crane business when I was a young engineer, because that would have been a really fascinating business to be in. What I don't know is how we're going to deal with this densification of economics and of living when we're aging. Because if we don't address the quality of that aging and the quality of our environment and the quality of how our government policies, our social systems, our education, and our functioning way we work, this is going to be a very unsustainable environment. We're going to have a very large number of older people of poorer health living in denser environments for which the cost of delivery and everything else is going to be just staggering. But some of the points on here are even more important. Aged 80 or older will quadruple to 400 million. Silver care is a major new business environment, but it's also a major new public health policy. Most of our retirement schemes and our businesses were designed around the notion that we would retire at some age in the middle 60s, and if we were fortunate, we would live to 80, and our actuarial calculations of how much retirement we needed would be sufficient. With 400 million people living beyond the age of 80, I would suggest that without some modification, the resources necessary to provide a quality of life are going to be strained. 80% will live in low to middle income countries, and Italy, Japan, and Spain, 1 in 3 people is expected to be 65 or older. So they are no longer envisioned to be in the workforce, they're going to be provided for. And if we don't address the quality of health and life that they are going to live, the cost impact on society is going to be staggering. I remember as a young engineer facing the challenge at Lilly when the purchasing reported to me at that time, and this guy came in and said, we can no longer find sufficient porcine pancreas glands to produce enough insulin for the world. At that time, Lilly was the largest producer of insulin in the world, and the reaction for the company was, that's unacceptable. But what other solutions did we have? Fortunately, we had DNA that had just been worked out through Genentech and the City of Hope. And I remember the thought process at that time, how would one go about allocating insulin when it's so necessary for life? And I can imagine that same very difficult policy question that's fermenting right now. How are we going to care for people who are going to live longer in more dense environments if we can't address the quality of how they live? And here's the reason why. By 2030, it's expected that debt, government debt, will be equal to the GDP. I don't have to be a PhD in economics to say that is not the direction we should be headed, and especially the slope of the curve to get there. It will force governments to ration, and the rationing will be toward those for which there is the greatest potential, and I fear that that would marginalize those who are older and not in the productive part of life. So we have a moral imperative to do something more than just address this, and that's why I mentioned that I think from a commercial standpoint we should be focusing on the business of silver care. The spending power of these consumers is going to increase, and lots of things need to be done. We can care for people using artificial intelligence and robotics in a number of ways in a perfectly sane and humane way, and we can actually provide more individual care for them, than what we now determine to be the human interaction, because oftentimes that human interactions come at the cost of the lowest paid employee in the healthcare system, who's barely able to survive themselves. And while there are many well-meaning and hardworking young men and women in that space, they oftentimes provide only a marginal interface. We need something new. Current approaches have not, and they're less likely to produce results in the future than they have today. We can't apply the same scientific model and thinking that we do to solving non-small cell lung cancer as to something to delay aging, as Zan so documented. If we look at an improving life quality curve for healthy individuals, the size of the trial necessary to distinguish the separation would be astronomical and unrealistic. We cannot afford the cost of developing new medicines without imagining a fundamental way of providing for those costs, and that requires some very interesting discussions. I think we are today at the scientific level to imagine a quality of aging and life that would be something we'd all aspire to and sign up for. But it's going to take a bridge between where we are and where we need to be. And that will engage people influencing a variety of constituents, including regulatories, scientific community, drug development agencies, et cetera. We need to focus on the consumer. I will set forth, and I'll talk a little bit about it tomorrow, but I'll set forth this notion that this individual ownership, the activation of that person to becoming fully engaged in working on this, is an essential component. And in doing so, we need to convert this patient from a passive reactive individual to one that is in charge. And we can acknowledge today that if all we use are current treatment modalities, the current healthcare system simply cannot afford that. I've been involved with a number of companies, both at Lilly and 3 or 4 biotech companies that I helped work on, found, and I've seen where we activate the patient, the results are dramatic, most notably, of course, in pain, but recently with a company called Ironwood, where customer activation in constipation-induced irritable bowel syndrome produced a phenomenal response, not only in patients being able to talk to their doctor about the problem, but knowing that there was an expectation of something other than a laxative to treat the disease gave them some hope and engaged them into a position and turned a negative into a positive. Why not obesity and diabetes? Why not empower people to demand more and create more expectation? Well, partly because we don't necessarily have a solution for diabetes. All we have done is treat the symptoms for many, many years. We don't have a chance on the underlying yet. But I think if we focus on the consumer, there are integrated ways in which we can take these forward. But let's recognize this is a long-term journey. It's not unlike the anti-smoking campaign or reduction in sugar consumption. We need to think about purpose-driven movements, and those have produced mixed results. When they are about people who are suffering from something being proposed by people who don't suffer from something, it comes across as another lecture or a moment of leverage that has not always worked. This is a large societal problem, but the solutions lie at the individual level. I think we should be thinking about this in a way to empower individuals to have a sense of hope and excitement about living a quality life, and that they are in charge, and that there are support areas that will enable them. Why not a support group for metabesity that's similar to the support group for breast cancer? We haven't thought about it in those kind of contexts yet, and I think that's where we're going to have to be. And I'm so delighted this Congress is focused on this subject because I think this is a long journey. I'll end with this. I think we have to figure out a way to get education back on track to teach things like physical education, civics, home economics, health education. In the United States, we've abandoned some of these core curriculum in the drive for more efficient education, and I'm a product of the STEM system, so I'll acknowledge we've pushed more mathematics and science in, and oftentimes it's been at the expense of teaching the basics of life. What does it mean to be a citizen in a country? What does it mean to expect rights? Well, it means that you also have obligations. That's the other side of the coin. What does it mean to think that everything that happens to me is not a result of somebody else's doing it? Sometimes what happens to me is a result of what I did. And if that's the case, then I can be responsible for making a change. That creation of an ownership is at the core of the empowerment of the individual taking charge. We were talking this morning at breakfast about how difficult it is to know not to eat the extra piece of bacon. And yes, this morning I got 2 pieces of bacon. I could have done with 1. And as I was sitting there thinking, I thought, well, maybe I needed my avatar, Richard, to, or Zan, or somebody to come up on my Google glasses and say, no, 1's enough. You'll be satisfied with that. We need both carrots and sticks, and I would argue that patient ownership is a powerful tool, but it needs to be supported. And from a policy standpoint, this is simply not a group of people getting together and say, let's form a new foundation. We need all of the silos in government, in academia, in industry, and in patient representatives who are passionate about defending rights at the drop of a moment when somebody thinks that one's rights being violated. I would argue that we could make a compelling case that the rights of individuals are being violated by not engaging them to fully own and change what is an impending difficulty for us. Thank you very much.